In the hills of Odd, West Virginia, there's a family that lives in conditions most Americans haven't seen since the Great Depression. No running water, no electricity in parts of the house, a collapsing structure held together by rust and rotting wood. But that's not what makes the Whitaker family unusual. What makes them unusual is that they're the most inbred family in America, the result of generations of incestuous relationships that have left them with severe physical and cognitive disabilities. And they're still alive, still living in that same hollow, still existing in a world that's forgotten them. This isn't ancient history. This isn't a mystery from 100 years ago. The Whitaker family is alive right now in 2025, living in conditions and circumstances that most people thought disappeared from America decades ago. Their story raises questions we're uncomfortable asking. Questions about poverty, about isolation, about what happens when a family is left completely alone for generations. Questions about whether survival is enough, or if there's something more we owe each other as human beings. The Whitakers live in Odd, West Virginia, a community so small it barely registers on maps. It's in Raleigh County, deep in Appalachia, where hollers, narrow valleys between steep mountains, hide families that have lived the same way for generations. The roads are barely maintained. Most houses are trailers or structures that would be condemned anywhere else. There's no industry, no jobs. People survive on disability checks, food stamps, and whatever odd work they can find. It's beautiful country if you like mountains and forests. It's desperately poor if you're trying to live there. The Whitaker family has lived in Odd for at least 5 generations, possibly longer. Records are spotty. People in these hollers don't always register births or deaths officially. They handle things themselves. The family consists of several members, though the exact number changes depending on who's still alive and who's living in the house at any given time. The most well-known members are Betty, Lorraine, Ray, and Timmy. There are others, cousins, siblings, relatives whose exact relationship is impossible to determine because the family tree doesn't branch. It loops back on itself over and over. Betty and Lorraine are sisters, both in their 60s or 70s. It's hard to tell their exact ages because their physical development was so stunted. Ray is their brother, though some reports suggest he might also be their nephew or cousin. Timmy is related to all of them in ways that become impossible to track when you realize that the same man might be someone's father, uncle, and grandfather simultaneously. That's what happens when families interbreed for generations. The relationships become a tangled web where everyone is everyone else's relative in multiple ways. The Whitaker family came to widespread attention in 2004 when photographer Mark Laita visited them as part of a project documenting poverty in Appalachia. Laita was working on a series about economic inequality, traveling through West Virginia, photographing families that had been left behind by America's economic progress. When he arrived in Odd and found the Whitakers, he realized he'd stumbled onto something far more complex than simple poverty. This was genetic devastation. This was what happens when isolation and incest combine over multiple generations. Laita's initial photographs showed a family living in conditions that seemed impossible in modern America. The house, if you can call it that, is a structure of weathered wood and rusted metal. Parts of the roof are missing. Windows are broken or covered with plastic. The porch sags dangerously. Inside, there's no running water. They use an outhouse. No central heating. They heat with wood stoves when they can afford wood. The floors are rotting. Walls are covered with grime. It's the kind of place that makes you wonder how anyone survives a West Virginia winter there. But the physical conditions of the house were just the surface. What struck Laita was the family members themselves. Betty and Lorraine communicate primarily through grunts and gestures. They can understand some speech but can barely form words themselves. Their cognitive abilities are severely limited. Ray can speak a little, but his speech is slurred and difficult to understand. He rocks back and forth constantly, a self-soothing behavior common in people with severe developmental disabilities. Timmy appears to be the most functional, but even he operates at what doctors would likely classify as a severe intellectual disability. He can perform simple tasks, understand basic instructions, but complex thought seems beyond him. The physical deformities are obvious. Several family members have facial abnormalities, misshapen jaws, unusual skull structures, eyes that don't align properly. These are classic signs of inbreeding. When close relatives reproduce, recessive genes that normally wouldn't express themselves get doubled up. The results can range from minor to catastrophic. In the Whitaker family, you're seeing the catastrophic end of that spectrum. Generations of incest have accumulated genetic damage to the point where normal development became impossible. Laita returned to the Whitaker family multiple times over the years, building a relationship with them. In 2020, he created a YouTube video that went viral, bringing the family to international attention. The video showed him visiting the house, bringing them food and supplies, interacting with family members who seemed simultaneously childlike and ancient. The video has been viewed millions of times. Comments ranged from sympathy to horror to accusations that Laita was exploiting them. But the video did something important. It forced people to confront a reality that exists in America right now, not in history books, but on a dirt road in West Virginia. So how did this happen? How does a family become this inbred in modern America? The answer is isolation, poverty, and cultural patterns that stretch back generations. Appalachia has always been isolated. The mountains create natural barriers. Communities in these hollers developed independently, cut off from outside influence. For much of American history, that isolation was geographic. You literally couldn't easily leave these valleys. Roads were poor or non-existent. Travel was difficult. So communities became insular. People married within their immediate area because that's who they knew. Now add poverty to that isolation. When you're desperately poor, when you're struggling just to survive, social norms start breaking down. Marriage outside the family requires resources. You need to be able to travel, to meet people, to participate in social activities. If you're barely scraping by, those things become impossible. So marriages happen within the family because those are the only people available. It starts with the cousins marrying. Then over generations, it gets closer. Siblings, parents, and children. The genetic consequences accumulate slowly enough that each generation might not seem much worse than the last, until suddenly you have people like the Whitakers. There's also a cultural component that's uncomfortable to discuss. In some isolated Appalachian communities, there's a long history of accepting relationships that would be considered incestuous elsewhere. Not because people don't understand it's wrong, but because the isolation creates situations where normal social rules get suspended. When your entire world is a quarter-mile hollow with 3 or 4 families, when everyone is already related to everyone else in some way, the taboos that exist in larger society start to feel arbitrary. This doesn't excuse it, but it explains how it happens and continues. The Whitaker family's genetic problems suggest at least 3 or 4 generations of close inbreeding, maybe more. Geneticists who've studied photographs of the family estimate that the level of homozygosity, having 2 copies of the same gene, is consistent with repeated parent-child or sibling-sibling relationships. This isn't first cousins marrying once. This is multiple generations of the closest possible genetic relationships. The results are profound. Not just physical and cognitive disabilities, but shortened lifespans, higher rates of illness, and problems that will only get worse with each generation. Here's what's particularly tragic. The Whitaker family doesn't understand what's been done to them. They don't have the cognitive capacity to grasp that their conditions are the result of choices made by previous generations. They're living with the consequences of decisions they didn't make and couldn't control. Betty and Lorraine didn't choose to be born into a family with this genetic history. Ray and Timmy didn't choose their disabilities. They're victims of a cycle that started long before they existed. But they're also trapped in that cycle. When Mark Laita asked Timmy about relationships, about whether anyone in the family had partners, the answers were vague and concerning. It's unclear whether new children are being born into the family. It's unclear what the current relationships are. And that vagueness is part of the problem. In these isolated communities, documentation is sparse. People don't always register births. Authorities don't always investigate. And so the cycle potentially continues, hidden from view, generation after generation. The house where the Whitakers live is literally falling apart around them. When Laita first visited in 2004, the structure was already in bad shape. 20 years later, it's miraculous it's still standing. The roof leaks. The foundation is rotting. In winter, temperatures inside barely stay above freezing. They survive on government assistance, disability checks for the family members who qualify, food stamps, occasional charity from neighbors, or visitors like Laita. It's subsistence living. They're not thriving. They're enduring. The question that haunts everyone who learns about the Whitaker family is, what do we do about this? They're American citizens living in conditions that would be illegal in most contexts. If these were animals, authorities would intervene for welfare violations. But because they're human adults, because they're technically living independently, there's legal ambiguity. Adult Protective Services has been contacted multiple times. But the Whitakers don't want to leave their home, and they don't meet the legal threshold for forced intervention because they're not an immediate danger to themselves or others. They're just living in poverty and disability in a collapsing house, and in America that's not technically illegal. There have been attempts to help. Local churches have brought supplies. Volunteers have made repairs to the house, though the fundamental problems are beyond fixing without tearing it down and starting over. Laita himself has provided financial support, buying them food and necessities. But these are temporary solutions. The underlying problems, the genetic damage, the cognitive disabilities, the complete lack of education or life skills can't be fixed with donated groceries or patched roofs. Some people argue the family should be moved into care facilities where they'd have proper medical attention, nutrition, and shelter. But the Whitakers have lived in that hollow their entire lives. It's the only world they know. Moving them to an institution would be traumatic, possibly fatal. There are documented cases of severely disabled people dying shortly after being moved from familiar environments to institutional care. The stress of change, even change to objectively better conditions, can be lethal when someone's entire existence has been defined by one place. Others argue that authority should have intervened generations ago, that allowing this family to continue living and potentially reproducing is unethical. But that raises equally disturbing questions about forced sterilization, about government control over reproduction, about where we draw the line between protecting vulnerable people and violating their autonomy. These aren't easy questions. There are no clean answers. The Whitaker family also raises questions about poverty in America that we'd rather not confront. They're living in conditions we associate with developing nations. No clean water, no proper sanitation, no health care, no education. And they're not alone. There are thousands of families in Appalachia living in similar conditions. Maybe not with the genetic problems of the Whitakers, but with the same grinding poverty. America is the richest country in human history, and yet people are living like this within our borders. The opioid crisis has made things worse in Appalachia. Already struggling communities have been devastated by addiction. The Whitaker family's hollow is surrounded by areas where overdose deaths have reached epidemic levels. Economic opportunities that once existed, coal mining, timber, manufacturing, have disappeared. The people left behind have nothing. No jobs, no prospects, no way out. And in that vacuum, social structures break down. Families like the Whitakers become possible because there's no functioning community around them to intervene, to provide alternatives, to break cycles. When Laita's videos went viral, thousands of people offered to donate money to help the Whitakers, and money has been sent. But what do you do with money when you're cognitively unable to manage it? When you don't understand banking or budgeting? When your entire frame of reference is survival day to day? The money helps. Laita uses it to buy them supplies, but it doesn't change the fundamental reality of their existence. They're still trapped in that house, in those bodies, in that genetic legacy. There are broader lessons here about what happens when communities collapse, when isolation becomes total, when poverty becomes generational. The Whitakers aren't unique. They're extreme, but they're not unique. In hollers throughout Appalachia, there are families with similar stories. Maybe not as severe, maybe not as visible, but the same patterns of isolation, poverty, and social breakdown that created the Whitakers are creating other tragedies we're not seeing. The uncomfortable truth is that the Whitaker family exists because society allowed them to exist. Not through deliberate cruelty, but through neglect, through creating economic systems that left entire regions behind, through failing to provide basic services to rural communities, through allowing isolation to become so complete that families could literally breed themselves into genetic catastrophe without anyone noticing or caring. The Whitakers are a failure of society as much as they're a tragedy of genetics. Mark Laita continues to visit the family regularly. His videos document their daily lives. Ray rocking on the porch, Betty and Lorraine communicating in their wordless way, Timmy trying to explain things with his limited vocabulary. The videos are sometimes hard to watch, not because of anything graphic, but because of what they represent. These are human beings living lives of such limited possibility that it's almost unbearable to contemplate. They'll never read a book, never have a meaningful conversation, never understand abstract concepts. Their world is that house and the immediate area around it. That's all it's ever been. That's all it ever will be. Some family members have died since Laita first made contact. The exact details are unclear. Again, documentation in these communities is spotty. But the family is smaller now than it was 20 years ago. Eventually, probably within the next decade or two, the remaining Whitakers will die. The house will collapse completely, and that particular genetic line will end. But the conditions that created them, the poverty, the isolation, the abandonment, will still exist. Other families in other hollers will face similar circumstances. And unless something fundamental changes about how we approach rural poverty in America, the cycle will continue. The Whitaker family's story is ultimately about what we owe each other as a society. Do we have an obligation to intervene when people are living in conditions like this? Do we have a right to intervene when they're legally adults making their own choices, even if those choices are made with severely limited cognitive capacity? How do we balance respect for autonomy with protection of vulnerable people? These are questions philosophers have debated for centuries. The Whitakers force us to confront them in concrete, uncomfortable terms. There's also the question of dignity. The Whitakers didn't ask to be filmed. They didn't ask to become internet curiosities. Laita has been careful to treat them with respect, but there's still something voyeuristic about millions of people watching videos of severely disabled people living in poverty. Are we trying to understand and help, or are we just staring at something shocking? The line between documentation and exploitation is thinner than we'd like to admit. But perhaps making people uncomfortable is valuable. Perhaps forcing people to see that the Whitakers exist, that this level of poverty and genetic devastation is happening in America right now, is necessary. We can't fix problems we refuse to acknowledge. The Whitakers are real. Their suffering is real. Their existence is a challenge to the narrative that America has solved poverty, that modern medicine and social services protect everyone, that these kinds of situations don't happen anymore. They do happen. They're happening right now. In odd West Virginia and in countless other places we're not looking. The Whitaker family is just the example we can see because Mark Laita put a camera on them. How many other families are living in similar conditions without anyone documenting them? How many other genetic disasters are unfolding in isolation because no one is paying attention? The story of the Whitaker family doesn't have a clean ending because it's not over. They're still there, still living in that collapsing house, still surviving day by day with limited understanding of why their lives are this way. Maybe that's the lesson. Not every story has a resolution. Not every problem has a solution. Sometimes all we can do is bear witness and acknowledge that this is real, this is happening, and we as a society have allowed it to happen. The next time you drive through rural America, through areas that look beautiful but feel economically dead, remember that behind some of those doors are people living in conditions you can't imagine. The Whitakers aren't an anomaly. They're the visible tip of a much larger problem. And until we're willing to confront that problem, really confront it, not just express sympathy and move on, families like the Whitakers will continue to exist in the shadows of the richest country in the world.